Now let's move to the economic side. The China-US trade war that began in 2018 has already caused tremendous damage to both countries. So the question is, like, under the Biden administration, will the economic decoupling between the two countries be eased, or it will be the opposite? Like, there will be even more fierce conflicts over the economic issues like tariffs, exchange rate debate, and also the argument around state-owned enterprise, IP issue. You can have a long list of those issues. So like Professor Saich and Dr. Wang, what's your view on that?
I mean, first on the trade war, it's clear in statements that have been made that they're not going to lift yet the tariffs, which was imposed by the Trump administration. Personally, I find that a little bizarre because there is no real evidence that shows they've been beneficial to the US economy and perhaps have been even detrimental to the US economy. So why do you want to keep in place a policy which is actually detrimental to your own country? I don't really understand that. I do understand it in a political sense that the Biden administration does not want to be seen as being weak, and they would be attacked, I think, if they lifted those tariffs. There's two very important points about the trade, though. The first is the idea that it's somehow a zero-sum game is, of course, a nonsense. And secondly, related to that, if you look at the trade deficit, it doesn't reflect the true situation of the economic interaction between the countries. Many, many years ago, Larry Lau, the economist, calculated what he called the value added into trade. And if you calculate that in, the trade deficit drops by between a third and a half. Now, let me give you one example. Producing Apple iPhone, something like that. 3.4% of that value stays with China, yet it sells at $240. So $240 gets booked in the trade figures, but that's not real. I mean, that's not a reality of what China is actually taking from that. It also ignores the fact that US companies sell over $200 billion worth of goods in China. So this is a much more complex picture than it's being painted. And someone really needs to get a hold and grip of this. And trade, China has been more dependent on exports to America than the other way around, although US exports have increased significantly. There's a couple of areas for the US consumer which could be problematic. 80–90% of laptops in America come from China, similar with iPhones. So it needs to be looked at really carefully. The bigger question of decoupling, again, goes back to some of the points that Huiyao and I have raised before. There is such an interlinkage that complete decoupling is impossible, which is not to say that it won't increase in certain areas. So, there's faults there on both sides. And I think it depends where you look. I think trade will decrease, and I think China is looking for other markets. So as it's not so over-dependent, not necessarily just on the US, but also on the European Union. But if we take the financial sector, for example, that's $5 trillion worth of business. And China really needs access to global financial markets. So it's very heavily in China's interest to stay engaged in that sphere. And I think Beijing has been quite clever in indicating to Wall Street that it's going to be willing to make it easier for financial institutions to operate in China, possibly driving a wedge between Wall Street and Washington. So financial decoupling is much more difficult to imagine. FDI, I think from both sides, is again probably going to decline. Most Chinese investment FDI into the US today has not really been strategic. It's been one-off, it's been trophy projects, which is very different from US investment into China, which is a part of their global production and supply chains, a much more strategic aspect. But I think because of things around the unlevel playing field that may, in the US business community sense, China's own policies, Made in China 2025, is probably going to reduce those levels. And similarly, Washington's actions to restrict Chinese investment and collaborations in certain areas is also going to put up barriers to Chinese investment. So it's not going to decouple completely. But I think in certain areas we will see shifts. But like a lot of what we've talked about in this discussion today, yes, competition in some areas, but some areas it's just mutually beneficial, and that will continue.
Yeah, I agree with what Tony just said. I think that decoupling is not really the option. Well, I think that we're really living the 21st century. I mean, since opened up, there's about 50,000 U.S. companies set up operations in China, generated $700 billion revenues, as Tony rightly said. There Apple made in China, China made $50 bucks in the international market. It's a global value chain. China has played a platform role, maybe making, but then the design, all the value added, all the chips, so this is actually decoupling. I mean, we're causing the international shortage of the chips now, because everybody is worried about future tech war, and now a lot of automakers is stop the manufacturing because they don't have the chips anymore. That's really absurd, but also it's going to really damage hugely the U.S. business. I mean, after all, I mean, look at the GM, Ford, or even all those European automakers sells more cars in China than their own countries. I mean, Apple, China's Apple's second largest market as well. So I do think that this kind of decoupling cannot really sustain. And now China has continued to open up. China set up a 2021 free trade zone, and Hainan being the largest. Financial sector, China has been completely opened up. And also, the President Biden still talk about China's, technology, IPR protection and things like that. But China now applies more patents than the U.S. company now, and the largest patent complication comes from China. Chinese companies have the same desire, not even less than the international and U.S. companies. So I think things can be really addressed. And China wants to jump TPP, CPTPP now, which is designed by the U.S. for a higher standard, IPR and intellectual property, and also SOE reform and environment standards, and also, of course, data flow and labor rights, what have you. So you see, China is not afraid of changes, and China wants to do that, and WTO reform too. So I really hope that we come back to this kind of platform and talk and negotiate, and then set up good examples for the rest of the world, because I think the trade has really benefit all countries. As Tony also said, I mean, the trade, I read one of your articles, that trade has from US to China since China joined WTO has gone up 500%. That's 5 times. So China has actually, GDP has gone up 10 times since China joined. It's good for both countries and for the world. So I really hope that we will follow those economic rationality, and then let's move from get aside those geopolitical, which I think are going to damage both countries in the long run.
Yeah, I think one of my colleagues, Bill Overholt, I think has made a very valid point. That from our perspective, from the US, there's many things we can be critical of China's behavior, but we should be critical of the right things, not the wrong things. And I think what is happening at the moment is everything's getting piled in as if everything is wrong. As you correctly said, Huiyao, and again, this is a point Bill Overholt made, China saved GM. GM might have well gone under without the China market. But there is an underlying issue where I think people in Washington and now the business community feel China may be making progress, but is not moving quickly enough. In some ways, yes, China is more open than our allies like Japan and South Korea in terms of business practices and engagement. But the real significant difference is, China is not the economy of 2000 when it joined WTO. And I think in those days, one could let a lot of practices and a lot of things slide. And now when you fast forward to 2021, where China is such a huge economy, can it really still operate under the principles in which it joined WTO, which gives it some elements of developing country status, some elements of developed country status. And I think if progress can be made in those areas, that would smooth the relationship enormously. Because otherwise we're going to continually get these criticisms. Oh, there's not a level playing field. Foreign business is not well treated, too much stealing of property rights and intellectual property, so on and so forth. And that's something I think both capitals really need to work on.
Yeah, one thing has a close tie to the economic conflict is the technology competition between the two countries. Especially in recent years, the US has strengthened its blockade against the rise of China's technology, like from partnership between the companies to academia or cooperation between universities. So Dr. Wang and Professor Saich, the question is, are there a better way to kind of alleviate the US concern about the rise of China's technology power, or do you think this kind of blockage and suppression will be continued? Which even include the prohibition of Chinese students from going to the United States to study, like in STEM degrees.
Well, I think that I really hope that the rationale will come back somewhat. I mean, I already see publicly Biden has done some of that. For example, Biden has really invited the President Xi to this climate summit. Former Secretary John Kerry has visited China. The senior official has met already in the last 100 days, twice already. And also that, China is really working towards, still very positively to help, facilitate the dialogue. And what I think that now is that there's no, we should really keep the academic and student exchanges. That's very vital. But it's also to the American interest. If you go to Silicon Valley, all those IT companies, 20-30% are Asians. A largely chunk of that is from China. And so I think it's to both U.S. and China interest if we strengthen these academic exchanges. And tech decouple is not really a possibility because China has already experienced all those restrictions in the old days. For example, in the 60s. When Soviet Union withdrew everything we had in China, China managed to do on its own satellite and all those technology development. So I think that you may slow down China a few years, but China probably could come up because it's the largest application market, and also there's other competition, EUs and other countries that come in. So I really think that in the long run we really need to work together. It's for the American interest. Otherwise. American will suffer. I do notice that the U.S. now is trying to correct some of the problem. For example, 1% of the Wall Street is almost equal to 43% of the mass population wealth in the U.S. And President Biden is trying to tax on those riches. So that to address the domestic issue, rather than using China as a scapegoat. As also Tony has rightly said, technology may have steal some of the jobs, not China steal all the jobs. So we really need to have a right perspective for that. I'm sure there will be competition, but let's have a peaceful competition. But then cooperation is really the key of the message.
Yeah, I think there need to be clear protocols agreed between the two countries on the technological space and also in the research sphere. On the question of STEM and STEM research, I'm not a specialist in that area, so I can't really speak clearly. But I think from Washington's perspective, what you really need is good national security advice. I have no idea what is, potentially dangerous research from a national interest perspective. And I'm sure the same applies in Beijing. And I think the authorities on both sides need to be clear about where a national interest might be infringed by allowing not just Chinese students, but students from other countries to engage in research in those areas. And the university should be guided by that. Beyond that, I agree 100% with Huiyao that the more collaboration, the better. At the Ash Center, we have up to about 30 fellows from China every year. We've always found it incredibly beneficial, particularly when young PhD students have come for a year to work on public policy issues, public administration issues. I've always seen that of immense value. So I think in the current atmosphere, it's not surprising there is caution, but we don't want that caution to tip over to paranoia. And we want to try and ensure that the kinds of exchanges, as Huiyao says, are beneficial on both sides. But I'm sure both sides have national security concerns, which is going to restrict interactions in certain areas, and that is quite appropriate. It applies to all countries, really.
Yeah, I think that the best way to really build up the trust is through the academic, student, tourism, and the cultural exchanges. Absolutely. and Tony, you have played a lot of role in Bridge the Gap. It's really, we need to strengthen that. I think you're right, probably, but also US maybe relax on Huawei or ZTE or Alibaba or something. But that'd be really great if we can see that happen.
Yeah, look, one promising area of collaboration between the two countries lies in climate change. Both of you mentioned that the climate envoy, John Kerry, visited China earlier this month, and he's the first official representative from Biden administration to visit China. He has already conveyed the intention to cooperate on climate change issues. So, however, many scholars are still worried that the potential cooperation would be affected by the overall Sino-US conflicts. Just cautious time, we don't have enough time, but can you quickly comment on this one? What's your views on the climate change cooperation?
Yeah, I mean, it always has been one of the obvious areas for potential collaboration. It falls into what I talk about as being a collaboration on new public goods, where the existing norms and institutions are not settled. And I think those are areas where China and the US and other countries can collaborate, areas of global commons like climate change, global engagement with natural disasters, global regulation for some of these tech and other areas we've talked about. And I thought it was very interesting, I know we're short of time, that what Kerry said was he felt this was so important that it should be divorced from other contentious areas such as views on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Taiwan, and trying to mark out a terrain for collaboration. Whether that's politically acceptable in Washington, I think we're going to have to watch and see.
Absolutely. I think he's doing the right thing. I'm quite impressed with the former Secretary John Kerry, the special envoy now for President Biden. I met him last year, February, at Munich Security Conference. He came to a CCG roundtable and he was giving a great speech then. He talked about, the same idea as Tony mentioned. I really think that given the current very negative sentiment, President Biden has done something like having a 2-hour-long phone call with President Xi at the eve of Chinese New Year. He stopped also using the ethnic or nationality language to refer COVID-19 virus, basically stopped banning using the China virus. So he's done quite a few things, but also he's also emphasized the alliance of that. But I would say that allies also have a lot of collaboration with China. So we need really, China, US need some time to build up the trust, even from the small areas. Let's do this through climate change. It would be a great area being the two largest economies. The next area would be pandemic, that fighting, if we can work together. Now, what happened in India? Really, it's an international crisis now. Both US and China probably can work together on that. And rather than putting a war against China, we should really work on helping solving humanitarian crisis. And finally, infrastructure. Biden proposed $2.3 trillion the US infrastructure. And China is probably now has all the investment technology for the infrastructure, and then two countries can work together. So I think it's important to have the trust. That is really the most important thing. And then have the climate change. If we build some trust, that'd be really great. My staff was just telling me we had almost 1 million viewers online, and for our dialogue, this is really great. I mean, we need this kind of dialogue. I really enjoy it.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, the climate issue is something so important that the two countries must find ways to work together, like for our planet and also for our future generations. This panel discussion is coming to an end. Allow me to kind of express our sincere appreciation on behalf of China Society at Kennedy School to Professor Saich and Dr. Wang for bringing us a very profound conversation on this very complex issue. Thank you both.
And thank you for the invitation. And great to see you again, Huiyao.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Tony. Thank you.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us today. All the best and have a lovely weekend. Bye-bye.